It's March 1938. A group of exhausted American engineers are standing in the middle of the Arabian desert at a drill site called Dammam Well Number 7. They've been here for 5 years burning money into sand. 6 wells, 6 failures. The executives back in San Francisco are drafting the termination letter. One more dry hole and they're pulling out forever. Then at 1,440 meters, the drill bit punches through. The pressure is so violent they can't cap it. Oil erupts into the sky. The engineers are screaming, not in celebration, in terror, because in that single moment they just handed a bankrupt tribal kingdom the keys to the global economy. Most people think Saudi Arabia got rich because they found oil. That's the Disney version. Venezuela found oil and they're eating zoo animals. Nigeria found oil and it funded decades of corruption. Russia found oil and it made oligarchs, not citizens, wealthy. No, Saudi Arabia got rich because they executed the slowest, most patient corporate takeover in human history. They took the resource back from the most powerful corporations on earth. They turned a commodity into a weapon, and then they pointed that weapon at the throat of the West and squeezed. This is not a story about geology. It's a story about the ledger, and how a kingdom went from charging pilgrims entry fees to owning the balance sheet of the modern world. Let's rewind to 1933. Picture the Arabian Peninsula. Not the glass towers and hypercar parades you see today. Picture dust. Picture poverty. Picture desperation. King Abdulaziz ibn Saud had just unified a collection of warring Bedouin tribes through decades of brutal conquest. He called it a kingdom. But kingdoms need money, and he had none. The primary revenue stream for this so-called nation was taxing Muslims who made the pilgrimage to Mecca. That's it, a toll booth to heaven. Then the Great Depression hit. Global travel collapsed. Pilgrim numbers dropped off a cliff. The royal treasury was empty. Cannot pay the guards empty. The king was so broke he had to borrow money just to feed his own family. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately. So he did what desperate men do. He made a deal. In May 1933, the king signed a concession agreement with Standard Oil of California. The terms were humiliating. The Americans got exclusive rights to explore and drill across 360,000 square miles of Saudi territory. In exchange, the king received $35,000 in gold up front. That's about $800,000 in today's money, for more than 1/3 square miles. He also got the promise of future royalties if they found anything, which everyone assumed they wouldn't. The British had already surveyed the region. Their geologists said the Arabian Peninsula was a barren rock. No oil. The Americans were taking a gamble, an expensive, stupid gamble. For 5 years they drilled and found nothing. Well after well came up dry. The cost was astronomical. The heat was unbearable. The logistics were a nightmare. Engineers were getting sick. Equipment was breaking down. Back in California, the board of directors was losing patience. They had spent millions. They had nothing to show for it. The memo went out. One more well. If it's dry, we abandon the entire operation. Then came Dammam Number 7 on March 4th, 1938. The drill broke through into a geological formation called the Arab Zone. The oil didn't trickle. It exploded. The flow rate was over 1,600 barrels per day. It was the richest oil strike in human history up to that point, and it wasn't a fluke. The geologists realized they weren't sitting on a pocket. They were sitting on an ocean. The Ghawar field would later be confirmed as the largest conventional oil field on the planet. Over 75 billion barrels of recoverable reserves. To put that in perspective, Saudi Arabia didn't just win the lottery. They won every lottery forever. But here's the part history textbooks skip. When the oil started flowing, the Saudis didn't get rich. The Americans did. The concession agreement was a masterpiece of colonial extraction. The Saudis got a royalty of 4 gold shillings per ton of oil extracted. That's about 21 cents a barrel. The Americans were selling that same barrel on the world market for multiple dollars. The profit margin was obscene. The infrastructure was American. The engineers were American. The technology was American. The money flowed out of the Gulf and into California bank accounts. The company they formed was called the California Arabian Standard Oil Company. Later, it was rebranded. You know the name. Aramco, Arabian American Oil Company. But don't let the name fool you. In the 1940s, there was nothing Arabian about it. It was a corporate colony. Saudi Arabia was a company town, and the company was foreign-owned. The king had saved his throne, but he had mortgaged his country's future. He was getting just enough money to stay afloat. But the real wealth, the margins, the control, was in American hands. And that arrangement might have lasted forever. Except the world was about to change, and the Saudis were paying attention. By the late 1940s, a wave of nationalism was sweeping across the colonized world. Countries were waking up to a simple, brutal truth. The West had spent a century extracting their resources and calling it business. In 1951, neighboring Iran decided to rip off the Band-Aid. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh moved to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He kicked the British out. He seized the oil fields. He declared Iranian oil belonged to Iranians. It sounded like justice. It ended in catastrophe. The British organized a global boycott of Iranian oil. No one would buy it. No tankers would ship it. Iran's economy collapsed within months. Then in 1953, the CIA and MI6 orchestrated a coup. Mossadegh was removed. The Shah was reinstalled. The message was clear. If you try to take the oil, we will destroy you. The Saudis watched this unfold and learned a critical lesson. You can't rob the Americans, but you can negotiate with them. And if you're patient enough, you can slowly, legally squeeze them out. Enter the most important Saudi you've never heard of. His name was Abdullah al-Tariqi. He was the first Saudi to earn a degree in petroleum engineering. He studied in Texas. He understood the American system from the inside. And when he came home, he brought a revolutionary idea. The Saudis should own their own oil, not through violence, through contracts, through tax law, through the ledger. In 1950, the Saudi government made its first move. They demanded a new deal, 50-50 profit sharing, or they would consider nationalizing the fields. The threat was real. The Americans panicked, not because of the Saudis, because of the Soviets. This was the Cold War. If Saudi Arabia nationalized and collapsed like Iran, the entire region could go communist. So the U.S. State Department stepped in. They brokered a compromise. A new agreement was signed. The profit split became 50-50. But here's the genius part. The Americans didn't actually lose money. The U.S. government allowed Aramco to count the payments to the Saudis as taxes, which meant Aramco could deduct those payments from their U.S. tax bill. In effect, the American taxpayer subsidized the deal. The Saudis doubled their income overnight. Aramco kept drilling. Everyone smiled for the cameras. But the Saudis weren't done. In 1962, a new player entered the game. His name was Ahmed Zaki Yamani. He became the Saudi Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources. He was smooth, Western-educated, Harvard Law, New York University. He wore Italian suits and spoke perfect English. But underneath the charm, he was absolutely ruthless. Yamani had one goal: take back Aramco. Not through force, through patience. He knew the Saudis lacked the technical expertise to run the oil fields alone. If the Americans left in anger, the pumps would stop. So Yamani designed a strategy. He called it participation. The idea was simple. Saudi Arabia would buy shares of Aramco, slowly, piece by piece, until they owned the whole company. In 1972, Yamani sat down with the Aramco executives and made an offer. The Saudi government wanted to purchase 25% of the company. The Americans resisted. Yamani smiled and reminded them that other oil-producing nations were nationalizing by force. He was offering to pay, take the deal or risk losing everything. In 1973, the Saudis acquired 25%. In 1974, they increased their stake to 60%. The Americans were still running the operations, but the ownership had shifted. Then, in 1980, the final transfer happened. Saudi Arabia purchased the remaining 40%. The deal was done. Aramco, the most valuable company in human history, was now 100% Saudi-owned. The Americans stayed on as contractors. But the boss had changed. This was the single most important corporate takeover in history, because it wasn't just about money. It was about control. Ownership meant the Saudis could decide how much oil to produce. They could decide who to sell to. They could decide the price. Oil was no longer just a commodity. It was a weapon. And in 1973, the Saudis proved they were willing to pull the trigger. It's October 6, 1973. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel. It's Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The war spreads fast. The United States immediately begins airlifting weapons and supplies to Israel. The Arab world is furious, but this time they don't just protest. They act. On October 17, 1973, Saudi Arabia and the Arab members of OPEC announce an oil embargo. They will cut production by 5% per month, and they will stop selling oil entirely to any nation that supports Israel, specifically the United States. The effect is instant and catastrophic. In the U.S., the price of oil quadruples. It goes from $3 a barrel to nearly $12. Gas stations run dry. Lines stretch for blocks. Fistfights break out at the pumps. The stock market loses $97 billion in 6 weeks. Inflation spikes. The economy staggers into recession. The era of cheap, abundant energy is over. Americans realize they are addicted, and their dealer just cut them off. But here's the twist. Saudi Arabia was selling less oil, but making exponentially more money. In 1972, Saudi oil revenue was $2.7 billion. By 1974, it hit $22.6 billion. The embargo was lifted in March 1974, but the lesson was permanent. The West could not survive without Saudi oil, and the Saudis knew it. There's a story that circulated during the crisis. Henry Kissinger, the U.S. Secretary of State, allegedly threatened to invade and seize the Saudi oil fields by force. King Faisal's response was ice cold. He said, "You are the ones who cannot live without oil. We come from the desert. Our ancestors lived on dates and milk. We can go back to that. You cannot." It was a bluff. But it worked, because the Saudis held the leverage. They had the resource, they had the control, and now they had the cash. But cash creates a new problem. What do you do with it? By the mid-1970s, Saudi Arabia was drowning in money. Billions were pouring in every month. The kingdom went from borrowing to survive to having more liquidity than the banks. But the Americans were terrified. If the Saudis decided to weaponize their wealth, the global economy could collapse. So Washington made a deal. In 1974, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Jeddah with a mission: secure an agreement. Do not come back empty-handed. The deal was never written into a formal treaty, but it became the invisible architecture of the global economy. The terms were simple. Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars. Every country that wanted Saudi oil would have to buy dollars first. This created artificial permanent demand for the dollar. It locked the dollar in as the world's reserve currency. In return, Saudi Arabia would take its surplus petrodollars and invest them in U.S. Treasury bonds, essentially loaning the money back to the American government. And the U.S. would provide military protection, advanced weapons, and guarantee the survival of the Saudi monarchy. It was a perfect loop. The U.S. bought oil. The Saudis bought U.S. debt. The U.S. used that borrowed money to fund the military that protected the Saudis. Everyone won, except the rest of the world. This deal explains everything. It explains why the U.S. has defended Saudi Arabia for 50 years despite human rights concerns. It explains why the dollar remained dominant even as America's industrial base declined. It explains why you can't understand modern geopolitics without understanding the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia wasn't just an ally. They were the central bank. And you don't bomb your banker. By 1980, Saudi Arabia had everything. They controlled the resource. They controlled the price. They had the ultimate security guarantee. They were untouchable. So they did what every nouveau rich does. They spent like there was no tomorrow. The government built a welfare state that would make Scandinavia blush. No income tax, free health care, free education, subsidized housing, gas cheaper than bottled water. Guaranteed government jobs where showing up was optional. It was paradise. For a while. But the oil market is cruel. In the 1980s, new supply flooded in from the North Sea, Alaska, and Mexico. Demand softened. Prices collapsed. In 1986, oil dropped below $10 a barrel. Saudi revenue fell off a cliff. The government was suddenly running a deficit. They burned through their reserves. For the first time in decades, they had to borrow money. The party was over, and the population was growing fast. Saudi families were large. By the 2000s, you had millions of young Saudis entering the workforce expecting the same cushy lifestyle their parents had. But the jobs didn't exist. Unemployment spiked. Frustration built. A generation raised on oil wealth was suddenly staring at austerity. Then in 2014, the bottom fell out again. Oil prices crashed from $115 a barrel to under $30. The Saudi government looked at the numbers and saw the future. At this burn rate, they would be bankrupt by 2020. The oil curse had finally arrived. They were a one-trick economy, and the trick was failing. They needed a new plan, and in 2015, they got a new leader to execute it. His name is Mohammed bin Salman, known globally as MBS. He's the crown prince, the heir, the power behind the throne, and he looked at the Saudi economy and decided it was garbage. He understood that oil dependence was a death sentence. The world was moving toward renewables. Electric vehicles were coming. Demand would peak and then fall. The kingdom needed to diversify or die. So in 2016, he announced Vision 2030, a plan to transform Saudi Arabia from an oil state into a global investment power. It sounded like corporate jargon, but it was a revolution. First, he needed capital, so he launched a shakedown. In November 2017, MBS rounded up over 200 Prince's businessmen and officials, his own cousins, his own family. He locked them inside the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh. He accused them of corruption. He froze their assets. He told them they could leave when they paid up. It was a hostage negotiation disguised as an anti-corruption drive. The result, over $100 billion in settlements. It was the largest wealth transfer in Saudi history. MBS consolidated power and capital in one move. Then he turned that capital into a machine. The Public Investment Fund, the PIF. This is the engine of modern Saudi wealth. It's a sovereign wealth fund with over $700 billion in assets. And MBS is using it to buy the future. Look at the portfolio. They bought a huge stake in Uber before it went public. They own a major piece of Lucid Motors, an electric vehicle company. They're betting on the end of oil. They bought Newcastle United Football Club. Sports washing, maybe. Profitable, definitely. They're pouring billions into gaming. They own stakes in Nintendo, Activision, and Epic Games. They're investing in AI, biotech, and entertainment. Do you see the strategy? They're using today's oil money to buy tomorrow's industries. And then there are the mega projects. Have you seen the line? A 170-kilometer-long mirrored city in the desert. Or NEOM, $500 billion Australian futuristic economic zone. Or Trojena, a ski resort in the Arabian desert where it hits 45 degrees Celsius in summer. Critics call it insane. Economists call it wasteful. But MBS calls it branding. He's changing the global perception of Saudi Arabia, from oil kingdom to innovation hub, from religious hardliners to entertainment destination. It's working. The world is watching. But there's a cost. When you move this fast, you break things. And in geopolitics, broken things bleed. In 2018, journalist Jamal Khashoggi walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He never walked out. Intelligence agencies confirmed he was murdered. The world pointed at MBS. For a while, Saudi Arabia became toxic. CEOs canceled trips. Politicians condemned the kingdom. Then oil prices surged, and the outrage faded. The world runs on energy, and Saudi Arabia still controls supply. By 2022, President Biden was in Jeddah fist-bumping the crown prince. Money heals wounds. Now Saudi Arabia is shifting the board again. The Petrodollar deal with America is cracking. The U.S., powered by fracking, no longer needs Saudi oil. China does. Beijing is now Riyadh's top trading partner, and it doesn't lecture about human rights. It signs checks. In 2023, Saudi Arabia restored ties with Iran, brokered not by Washington, but by Beijing. The message is clear. Saudi Arabia isn't a sidekick. It plays both sides for leverage. That was the strategy.